Okay, and just like we did in all the other chapters, we're going to wrap this up by talking about spinal muscles and function. So the learning objectives for this, just like in all the other chapters, identifying the primary muscles, the prime movers responsible for moving the spine and trunk, and that includes the head and neck. Their origins, insertions, actions, and innervations. This includes the muscles' anatomical relationship to each other, which one's superficial, which one's deep, which one's lateral, which one's medial, all that stuff using anatomical terms. You should be able to identify positions of active or passive insufficiency in any two-joint muscle, given the amount of time we have spent on active and passive insufficiency. However, we're not going to dwell on that with the spine. We're going to briefly touch on it and move on with our lives. So in terms of innervation to craniocervical and trunk musculature, it's a little bit simpler maybe than some of the innervation we've talked about in the extremities. The dorsal rami of the spinal nerves form short nerves that innervate most of the muscles, the posterior neck and trunk. And the ventral rami form the cervical, brachial, and lumbosacral plexes that innervate most of the muscles of the anterolateral neck and trunk. So each segment is innervated by the spinal nerve of that segment. So there's not specific nerves and nerve roots that we have to remember for these like we did for the extremities, because each segment innervates its own neighborhood, if you want to think of it that way. So that makes it a lot easier, I hope. So I'm going to divide this lecture, I think, into two parts. The head and neck muscles, and then the trunk muscles. So hopefully that'll make it easy. The muscle tissue on the vertebral column's posterior aspect between the 6th and 12th thoracic vertebrae, they're usually innervated by multiple dorsal rami from the spinal nerves T6 through T12. The muscle tissue of the anterior trunk was likely innervated by nerves from the ventral rami of T6 to T12. So that just kind of makes it easy. And because it's easy, we don't have to spend a lot of time on it, right? So the sternocleidomastoid, see, this is one of those muscles that I love that tells you exactly where it goes to and from. Sterno, it attaches to the sternum. Cleido, it attaches to the clavicle. Mastoid, it attaches to the mastoid. So the origin is the sternum and the clavicle. The insertion is the mastoid process. When we are starting to talk about the neck and trunk muscles, we are going to separate their primary action into bilateral when both sides contract at the same time, and unilateral when one side contracts and the other one doesn't. So bilateral action of the sternocleidomastoid is flexion of the head and neck. So it attaches to the head at the mastoid process, and it flexes the head and neck. So unilaterally, if you take your index finger and put it on your mastoid process, take your thumb on one side, and take your thumb and put it at the sternoclavicular joint or at the manubrium, and rotate to the opposite side, you will find that the thumb and the index finger get closer together, meaning the muscle is shortening, the muscle is contracting. So unilaterally, the sternocleidomastoid controls contralateral rotation of the head and neck. Also, lateral bending to the same side. So do some lateral bending and see that the origin and insertion move closer together. It gets the spinal accessory nerve just like the upper trapezius, cranial nerve 11. Because of its role in turning the head, cranial nerve 11 turns the head. It's a spinal accessory nerve. So very similar to the action to the upper trapezius. Also, because you get tired of typing out or writing out sternocleidomastoid, we call it the SCM just to make it easier. The scalenes are the next door neighbors to the SCM. They are more lateral. There are actually 3 heads of the scalenes, anterior, middle, and posterior, and they're all pictured here. They assist with inspiration via elevation into the first and second ribs. So the last section we're going to talk about is ventilation. Any muscle that can elevate the ribs can be an assistant muscle in ventilation, and we'll talk about that. So it originates on the transverse processes of the cervical vertebrae, and they insert on the first and second rib. So they can bilaterally assist in flexion of the neck. They're a very midline muscle, so there's not a lot of rotation. In fact, they don't have a line of pull for rotation. But unilaterally, they do lateral bending. And anterior rami of the lower cervical nerves. So just nerves in the neighborhood. So there are two groups of muscles that I'm not going to require you to memorize all the different muscles in the group, but I want you to think of them as a group, and the origin, insertion, action, innervation, what they do as a group. So the deep anterior group, their names are all listed there, but that's okay. You can know them, but you don't have to memorize them. They all, as a group, originate on transverse processes or transverse processes and the bodies of the vertebrae, and they insert on transverse processes on the bodies of the vertebrae above where they originated or on the occipital bone. And their job is flexion of the neck and head. And unilaterally, they do a little bit of lateral flexion. Their main purpose, though, is maintaining postural control. They're innervated by cervical nerves, not surprisingly. So they are one side of the teeter-totter on that class 1 lever for the atlanto-occipital joint. So they're the force or the resistance on one side or the other of the teeter-totter. The other group on the other side is the suboccipital muscles. So they are posterior. So the deep anterior muscles are anterior. The suboccipital muscles are posterior. The axis is in the middle. That's our balance. That's our class 1 lever. So these muscles originate on various parts of the atlas and axis, and they insert on the occipital bone and the C1 transverse processes. So they do extension of the head and upper cervical area, lateral bending, and ipsilateral rotation of the head. So they are also major players in maintaining postural control of the head, and they are, strangely enough, innervated by the cervical nerves. So the posterior craniocervical muscles include the splenius cervicis and the splenius capitis. The splenius capitis attaches to the head. It originates on the lower half of the nuchal ligament and the spinous processes of C7 through T3. And it inserts on the lateral superior nuchal line and the mastoid process, so on the cranium. So bilaterally, when both sides contract, you get extension of the head and neck. Unilaterally, you rotate and laterally bend the head and neck to the same side. If you're not sure about how that works, either get out a rubber band or a TheraBand or get your fingers on your splenius capitis and try those motions and see if you can figure that out. Cervical nerves, again, no surprise on there. Okay, the splenius cervicis has a similar line of pull. It's a little bit more inferior and it does not attach to the head. So it originates on the spinous processes of T3 to T6, and it inserts on the transverse processes of C1 to C3. So bilaterally it extends the neck, not the head, and unilaterally rotation and laterally bending the neck to the same side. So same actions as the splenius capitis, just leaving the head out of it, and same innervation as the splenius capitis. So you can think of these muscles, they sort of start in the middle on the spinous processes, and they go up and out like a poplar tree, if you want to think of it that way. So they spread their branches up and out. The upper trapezius we talked about in the shoulder chapter, of course, because it has a lot of action on the shoulder girdle. This is just a review of the origin, insertion, action, innervation, and you probably already know this. Well, you should already know this. So the way when the scapula and clavicle are fixed, the upper trapezius contributes to neck movement, and so it's helping to turn our head in response to things. So when when the head is the least fixed part, the neck is going to move. So that's always a good thing. Levator scapula lies deep to the trapezius and the SCM and the splenius capitis, and it contributes to neck motion again. And the same origin and insertion and action innervation as we talked about when we talked about it in the shoulder. But you can see how it has when the shoulder girdle is fixed, it has its function in neck motion. So fine-tuning the motions of the head and neck, control of the head and neck is essential for coordinated alignment of the eyes and ears, like turning to locate and listen to sound. We have reflexes that cause us to turn towards a sound. Neurologically, many of the head and neck muscles are closely linked to visual and vestibular systems of the brain. So when we're talking about balance, I always tell patients, I probably say this every single day in the clinic, but there are three main sensory inputs to balance: eyes, ears, and feet, if you want to say it that way. So your eyes, your inner ear, and your proprioception. And we'll talk way more about this in neuro. So you have to be able to move your head and neck in order to adjust your visual and vestibular systems. Really super important to neurological function. So neck muscles, head and neck turning and bending muscles are super, super important in our function as human beings. So the primary function of the deep craniocervical muscles and the suboccipitals is to fine-tune those head motions. The deeper craniocervical muscles are effective at neutralizing secondary actions that are otherwise dictated by the plane of the facet joints. So we talked about that in relationship to other muscles. Some muscles are going to neutralize to keep the head and neck stable. A lot of times we need to stabilize our gaze so we can scan something or look for moving objects. And those muscles help a lot to neutralize secondary actions. Okay, in the next section we're going to start to go into muscles of the trunk.